Hello Mabuhay, welcome back to another episode of my Rant Series, and this is another rant that is something very serious, in both legal and ethical standards, and that is none other than juvenile youth arrests. And quick note, when we talk about juvenile youth arrests, we are not talking about minimizing harm or ignoring victims. We are talking about children and adolescents whose brains, judgment, and impulse control are still developing, and about systems that choose punishment models designed for adults. This rant focuses on three things: the actual meaning of juvenile justice, direct accountability for authorities who push youths into adult courts, and how to avoid this harm through evidence-based youth care, especially for CICWTL children in conflict with the law. And no, I am not allowing people to get away from crimes. It's about protection and proper discipline, and separating justice cases between children and adults, okay? Anyways, let us begin. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, go. Oh gosh. Juvenile youth arrests are one of the most bizarre acts of criminal justice framework in terms of state legal duties. Juvenile justice was created on a simple principle: children are different from adults. That difference is not ideological, it is developmental, neurological, and social. Adolescents are more susceptible to peer pressure, more impulsive, and less able to assess long-term consequences. At the same time, they have a far greater capacity for rehabilitation and change. A system that recognizes this prioritizes accountability with rehabilitation, not retribution. It uses age-appropriate processes, privacy protection, family involvement, education, and therapeutic intervention. When those elements disappear, the system stops being juvenile justice and becomes adult punishment applied to minors. And to be clearly honest with you, placing minors in adult court is not a neutral procedural choice. It is a deliberate escalation of harm that could last for a very long time. Adult courts expose youths to harsher sentencing, permanent criminal records, public stigmatization, and environments that increase, not reduce, the risk of reoffending. Research across jurisdictions consistently shows that youths tried as adults are more likely to reoffend and less likely to reintegrate successfully. This is not deterrence, it is damage, and the damage might be done as a whole, and the reputation can almost never be repaired. A lot of people have been broken trust thanks to that, and let me say this to those who arrested those poor little children. Why would you look at a child and decide that adult court is the appropriate response? Why would you take a developing brain and place it into a full formal system, designed for fully formed adults? You do not get to claim public safety while placing children into systems designed to break adults. You do not get to call it justice when you remove rehabilitation, seal off second chances, and then act surprised when outcomes worsen. Why would you say they should have known better while ignoring everything we know about adolescent development? This is definitely, absolutely wrong, no matter what. You chose adult court, you chose permanent records, you chose punishment over correction. And when the child comes out more damaged, more isolated, and more likely to return, you do not get to call that success. You call this order keeping, when it is actually creating more harm, more repeat offenses, and more damaged lives. You call this discipline, when it strips away education, stability, and any realistic path back into society. You call this accountability, when the outcome is predictable. I learned that you then blame on the child instead of the system. You should target adults and look at who prey children for crimes instead of arresting children in adult systems. Instead, take the children who are accused of crimes to youth care facilities where they will be educated well and to bring them back to the community with a new spirit. Alright, let's move on. Discipline in youth care facilities for children in conflict with the law is not about humiliation, fear, or domination. Effective youth discipline is structured, consistent, and rehabilitative. It includes clear rules, predictable consequences, education continuity, mental health support, family engagement, and skills development. It addresses behavior without destroying identity. What it is not: solitary confinement, adult-style incarceration, verbal degradation, or indefinite punishment with no therapeutic goal. Facilities that operate this way are not correcting behavior, they are manufacturing trauma. for another question: how we avoid juvenile adultification. Just listen to what I say in the next few seconds, okay? No skipping. Avoiding the funnel into adult courts requires deliberate choices. 1. Raise and enforce minimum ages of criminal responsibility that reflect developmental science. 2. Use diversion first, especially for non-violent offenses. 3. Guarantee legal representation trained in youth advocacy. 4. Mandate capability-aware assessments, not just offense-based thresholds. And 5. Invest in community-based programs that address family, school, and mental health needs. The next part of this rant is something very problematic: the extremely low ages of criminal liability, which is very controversial and it can't be blindly accepted. In the United States, the problem is not hypothetical. Historically, some states set the minimum age of criminal liability extremely low, at times as low as 6, as was the case in jurisdictions like North Carolina prior to reform. That meant very young children could be formally arrested, processed, and exposed to systems never designed for them. In practice, this led to outcomes that should alarm any ethical system. A lot of children, sometimes in early elementary school, were handcuffed, charged, and in some cases held in adult detention environments, even if temporarily or due to lack of appropriate youth facilities. The justification was order and procedure. The result was confusion, trauma, and escalation. Examples reported across jurisdictions follow a familiar pattern. A child with behavioral or learning difficulties is treated as a public order problem. School discipline is escalated into law enforcement. Law enforcement defaults to arrest because the law technically allows it. The system functions as written and fails ethically. You call this order keeping? When the predictable outcome is fear, repeat contact with the justice system, and lifelong distrust of institutions. Reforms in some states have raised minimum ages and reduced transfers, proving that policy choice matters. Where the age floor is raised and diversion is mandatory, arrests drop, detention drops, and outcomes improve. Where the floor remains low, harm is not an accident, it is policy. And to be honest again, laws allowing juveniles to be tried as adults vary by state. Some rely on prosecutorial discretion or offense lists rather than individual assessment. The result has been disproportionate impact on marginalized youth, higher recidivism, and lifelong barriers to education and employment. Where reforms have reduced transfers to adult court and expanded diversion, outcomes improve, lower reoffending rates, better educational continuity, and safer communities. The evidence is not ambiguous. In the Philippines, the Juvenile Justice and Welfare Act recognizes the principle of rehabilitation for youth in conflict with the law. Diversion programs, youth intervention, and community-based care are legally prioritized. However, gaps in implementation, overcrowded facilities, inconsistent access to services, and public pressure for punitive responses undermine those protections. When fear drives policy, children are treated as threats rather than developing individuals. And now some examples. Note, they're not real, but they are implied examples that gets my point to the rant. The following examples are fictionalized, but they reflect patterns repeatedly documented in juvenile justice systems. Names, ages, and details are illustrative. A 6-year-old girl named Evan was referred to police after a classroom meltdown involving yelling and refusal to sit still. No injuries, no property damage. Arrest processed instead of behavioral support. Leah, who was 7, handcuffed after leaving school grounds without permission during an anxiety episode, labeled defiant conduct. Marcus, who was 9, was arrested for throwing a pencil and knocking over a chair during a disciplinary dispute, treated as criminal misbehavior rather than a regulation issue. Noah, who was 10, was cited for repeatedly pulling a fire alarm as a prank, disruptive and wrong, but handled through arrest rather than restitution and supervision. Ari, who was 11, charged for writing an exaggerated threat in a notebook with no plan, means, or intent, escalated from school discipline to law enforcement. Earl, who was 12, arrested for shoplifting low-value items with peers. No violence, first incident, yet processed instead of diverted to a youth program. Jalen, who was 13, taken into custody for refusing to comply with the school resource officer's verbal commands during a protest like disagreement, no physical harm. And finally, Maya, who was 14, was arrested for repeated truancy in curfew violations, treated as criminal liability rather than a family and education support issue. And above all, none of these actions required adult-style detention or criminalization to protect public safety. Each required context, proportion, and correction, not escalation. When systems respond to immaturity with arrest, they convert correctable behavior into criminal identity. That is not prevention. That is pipeline building. And this is the last straw. To law enforcers, prosecutors, jailers and other similar officers, you think that arresting poor little children so they can learn how hard life is will somehow prepare them for the future when they make a mistake? You think that showcasing adult prison references to children, cells, cuffs, records, threats of adult time will solve a problem that began with immaturity, instability, or unmet support. You think fear teaches responsibility better than structure, guidance, and correction? You think early exposure to adult punishment builds accountability, instead of normalizing trauma and escalation? If so, you all are dead wrong. You cannot fix youth behavior by copying adult punishment. You cannot claim safety while creating systems that increase harm. And you cannot call yourself ethical while ignoring decades of evidence because punishment feels politically convenient. I really feel bad for the children who did nothing wrong. So in conclusion, juvenile justice is a test of a society's maturity. Children in conflict with the law need accountability that leads somewhere, toward education, responsibility, and reintegration. Adult courts, permanent records, and punitive shortcuts fail that test. If you are an authority making these decisions, the responsibility is yours. Choose rehabilitation over escalation. Choose evidence over fear. Choose systems that correct behavior without destroying futures. And that's all for this rant. Remember this: keeping children safe does not mean hardening them through fear. It means training and raising children with deep love, respect, structure, and ethical care. Even when that work is difficult and slow. When a child does something wrong, the goal is not spectacle or punishment for its own sake. The goal is to stop further harm, understand what led to the behavior, and put supports in place so it does not happen again. Through guidance, accountability, education, and care, safety grows from prevention. Responsibility grows from correction that teaches. Futures are protected when systems choose rehabilitation over escalation. This is the end. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you haven't done already. And remember, keep the society safe, divert the youth away from adult criminal syndicates, always. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you later.